We're going to get started in a moment here. Looks like people are joining. Thank you for joining. Thank you for joining. We're going to get started in a moment. Thank you for joining. We're going to start in a couple minutes here. Handful more just joined. Thank you. Going to get started in a moment. All righty. Looks like we're at the top of the hour. We will get started here. Today's topic I want to talk to you guys about is what is Kubernetes? Why Openshift, right? When we talk about Openshift, what is it? And before we can even go down that route, really, what are containers? What are virtual machines? I think everybody has a good idea of what virtual machines are. I think VMware has done a good job of taking over that market, but what are containers to virtual machines? Do they replace them? Do they sit side by side? What does that look like? And really, what is Kubernetes? Why do I keep hearing about this Kubernetes thing when I hear about OpenShift? So let's jump in today and let's see here. Let me make sure. Click in right there. We go. Today we have. My name's Jerome Martin. I am Tech Data's Red Hat vendor leader. So I don't usually do these types of presentations, but happy to jump in here. My background is I used to live out in California before coming to Tech Data in Sunnyvale, and worked for some startups out there focused on cloud native development, and also consulted with think tanks around cloud strategy. And I think it's very interesting with the uptick in around OpenShift. I wish we had looked more into this tool because it would have saved a lot of time, a lot of custom development, and would have helped with a lot of integration with a lot of the services and tooling that we were using. And this was only 4 years ago. I'll be giving kind of presentation today, and excited to be here and talk about this topic. I also have Felicia Ward on, and she's our field solution architect for Tech Data. So if anybody has questions towards the end and they're too technical and stump me, I'm sure she'll jump in and help us out and get us an answer. So I just wanted to give you a little bit about my background before we jump into the topic today. So what are containers? It's interesting because it really does depend on who you ask. Containers mean different things to different people. But at the end of the day, in essence, containers are completely isolated environments. They have their own processes and services, just like virtual machines, except containers share the same operating system. So, right, I guess that kind of makes sense, right? You might be asking yourself, okay, I kind of get it. I'm familiar with virtual machines, so aren't they just like virtual machines? I have a ton of virtual machines in my environment. What's the difference? Do they replace them? Do they sit side by side? So containers are really just, they are simpler, they're lighter, they're more agile than virtual machines. They're portable across different environments, whereas virtual machines are not portable across the hypervisor. And for IT teams, they're readily accessible and easily shared. So one of the big differences too is that these application processes that you would containerize, they share the same kernel. They share the same underlying bit to the operating system. So you may see containers running different versions of a Linux OS, but because they're all Linux based, they can all run on that same instance of OpenShift. So now that we've touched containers, let's talk about virtual machines. I really like this example. It may be oversimplified, but I think it gets the job done. So for this example, we'll keep it simple with the hypervisors running on bare metal, right? You'll see the hardware piece at the bottom and the hypervisors on top, both for virtual machines and containers. Where it differs, though, is with containers. If we're looking at the right-hand side, you have that underlying hardware with the hypervisor running on top and a container host. That container host was known as Kubernetes. The Kubernetes container host can now manage the containers, the container applications utilized by the line of business within your organization. So these different applications that you are looking to build or containerize or port over, right? If you have legacy applications in your business that you are trying to break down into smaller applications so they're not so big and bulky and take time to deploy or set up. Taking these and containerizing these and then leveraging Kubernetes or that container host to orchestrate, deploy, initialize, leads to a lot of efficiency gains. And just to kind of have your mind thinking about this thing, if we switch over to the virtual machine side on the left-hand side, with VMs, you have the hardware with the hypervisor running on top, and each of these virtual machines has its own kernel or operating system. Let's just call it an operating system. And then the dependencies, the operating system dependencies that the application leverages. So companies utilizing virtual machines for everything have high technical overhead, right? High technical debt from running each of these operating systems for each of the virtual machines they use. Every time they spin up a virtual machine, it's spinning up an operating system. And this leads to higher utilization of the underlying resources, right? The hardware. They also consume a ton of disk space, right? So every time you are spinning up a virtual machine, we're talking about gigabytes, whereas containers are in the very low megabytes. And also, virtual machines have a longer boot time, right? There's more to boot up, right? Especially with the operating system. And what's also interesting is that you can run virtual machines side by side to containers. So this doesn't do a good job depicting that, but within Openshift virtualization, you can run a virtual machine next to a container on the Openshift container platform. But today we won't dive into that rabbit hole. That might get a little too technical. So I just thought it was a very interesting, I was reading an article about that this morning. So I wanted to just throw that in there. So when we're talking about portability, I brought that up earlier with VMs. I spoke to the non-portability across that hypervisor piece, that the VM piece, and not having portable packaging. So again, with your application sitting within a virtual machine, spinning them up across different infrastructures takes it goes back to those three pieces that I spoke to: the higher utilization of your resources, storage space being one of them, and then boot time, right? So that's just time. And I'll give you an example. When I was in Sunnyvale, one of the insurance companies we were brought in for, they had an application to check and run quotes, and that application took 30 minutes to run one quote. And if you can imagine, right, that team that is running quotes constantly for customers took a long time, and they'd end up having to hang up, run the quote, and then email a quote back. So if you're ever talking to an insurance company and they get your information and say, hey, we'll provide you a quote to your email, and it takes a while, it might be the folks I was, or one of their competitors at least, that was using VMs to run their applications. So with containers, though, you have the portability across any infrastructure with significantly less underlying resources. So does it get rid of virtual machines? Absolutely not. In the diagram there, you can see virtual machines running on the hardware. And now this gives different examples of that hardware. That could be virtualization, could be cloud, all the way out to that endpoint laptop that's being leveraged. So no, it doesn't get rid of virtual machines. It just reduces your dependency to virtual machines. So if you look at your bill for virtual machines and what you're spending there, you can significantly cut that and start investing into cloud native development and containerization strategy with Red Hat or with OpenShift. And it frees up capital so that your team can focus on new projects. So this is a very busy picture, but I think it's very interesting because this is, for you folks that are managing an IT team or you're an influencer on that team, you're very familiar with these services, these companies that provide technology services to get the job done, right? It could be service proxy or an underlying service mesh. It could be a platform, could be a database. So how are you leveraging these in your day-to-day? From my experience, the teams I was working with, they would have their, when they bring on a new employee, these folks would all have to be running the same versions of each of these tools, and the same OS, pulling from the same operating system dependencies and libraries. So it made it very difficult to have everybody on the same page, and it would just take a little extra love and care from an IT manager perspective to make sure that the development and the deployment and compliance and making sure policies are up to date across all of these different applications or technology services. It was a full-time job itself. So with this, right, let's jump into what is Kubernetes, because as we start looking into OpenShift, OpenShift starts providing major efficiency gains to this cloud native challenge. But first, before OpenShift, what is Kubernetes? We've talked about containers, we've talked about VMs. Let's touch the Kubernetes piece. So instead of me going through this slide, and I don't want to, not to point at the person that created it, but it's a very boring slide and it's a very technical slide. And I don't want to do that to you because first of all, I couldn't do that to you. I wouldn't even know how to walk through this. So I just want to give you an example. This is an example that I found on YouTube of all places, and I thought it did a great job explaining what IT teams run into when they're using those different technology services that I showed you that very cluttered slide on. So if you manage an IT team and you're looking to set up or develop an application comprised of 4 different technology services, right? For this project, we'll call this Project Midas. Project Midas uses a web server called Node Express. It uses a database, MongoDB. It uses messaging services like Redis and an orchestration tool, Ansible. So the application development will lead to a number of different issues. And this, again, this is the old way of doing things. I want to take you through the old way of doing things into what you could do with OpenShift and what you can do with OpenShift. So in the old way of doing things, you'll run into really 3 big issues. The first is the application evolution. As your IT team is evolving and using different versions of these technology services, just know that nothing is perfect for an IT developer. Just like a mechanic, you know, when I am, one of my hobbies is building cars, building motorcycles, and nothing's perfect for me. I always have to, I might buy a part, put it in, and then I look at it, I drive it, or I test it, and I don't like it. It's not necessarily what I thought it would be, so I go back to the drawing board. I got to find another piece that fits in there that will give me the performance I want. But then I might get that piece and it doesn't fit in the car, right? The best example I can give you is you buy a Ford Pinto and it doesn't go fast enough for you, so you buy one of those Dodge Demon engines. It doesn't fit in the engine bay, and you have an issue, right? You're gonna have to do some custom cutting to get it in there. So it's the same analogy there. I know everybody that is a creator, especially IT, especially on IT teams and developers, they're always going to go through new iterations of an application to make it better. You know, you as maybe the IT leader just want to get it deployed and out there, but they want to make it perfect, and that's just not reality. So as they're continuously trying to make it perfect, they start running into library, dependency, and operating system compatibility, right? These 3 pieces right here. They run into compatibility issues with each of these services because they're going to be pulling from them. So for example, if Node Express, if you're using 1.1 and that runs off of RHEL 3, but you're using MongoDB, the most up-to-date database of MongoDB, and that has to run on RHEL 8, you have an operating system incompatibility, and it doesn't work. So you either have to use a newer version of Node Express, which means that you might have to invest and pay for that, where you weren't initially thinking about that or allocated budget for it, or you're going to have to go to a lower version of MongoDB, but that doesn't give you the security or whatever it may be, right? Each of these different versions that you're going to use for these technology services, as you're building your application, they need to be on the same page and work with the same version of libraries that they're pulling from, the operating system dependencies that they're pulling from, and the underlying operating system. So this is the best example of how confusing the interaction between these technology services are and the underlying resources they need to run. So this confusing interaction and this compatibility issue is referred to as the matrix from hell, right? It is, you will constantly get stuck moving circle to circle, just going around in circles, trying to figure out what works with what and what's compatible with what. And again, back to it, it might not be the application you set out to develop, or it costed way more than you thought. So by the way, the third problem that I forgot there is when you're hiring a new person for your IT staff. If you think about it with COVID, especially, everything has changed. Our businesses have changed. There are people working remote now that didn't work remote. Teams are disparate. It's communication, it has been difficult. And if you see yourself and you're on one of those teams, right? Imagine hiring a new employee. Somebody that you hire, a new IT team person or a new developer that you bring on, they have to make sure that they're running the same version of all of those services, pulling from the same libraries, running the same operating system. There's a laundry list of tasks that they have to do so that they can develop side by side with their peers. And that takes a lot of time, and there's a lot of error now because you don't have the help of your manager over your shoulder or a peer or a team leader over your shoulder to help you set that up. So that's one thing that I've heard from a couple of my friends that are still in that space, that it's been very difficult for them to bring on new resources, new remote resources, just getting them set up. And making sure that they have everything set up appropriately to do their job. So how do you fix these issues? How do how do customers seamlessly and continuously develop Project Midas that we just talked about without breaking anything? How are you going to reduce the ramp time of your new hires? Well, that's where Kubernetes enters. So now you can run each component of Project Midas in a separate container with its own libraries and dependencies, all on the same virtual machine and operating system. This Kubernetes configuration needs to be built just once so that all new hires can get started with a simple run command instead of that laundry list of tasks, making sure that everything has been set up appropriately. So when I say Kubernetes configuration, I really mean to say Openshift container platform, right? Because Openshift container platform is a certified Kubernetes platform offering. And this is where you hear that notion of build once, deploy anywhere. So hopefully that walkthrough and that example made it easier to understand Kubernetes versus me just throwing up this slide and talking about how great Openshift is, right? To understand Openshift, you need to understand Kubernetes, because all Openshift is a smarter Kubernetes platform. If you look on the diagram, you can see Kubernetes towards the bottom there. It's a very small piece of what Openshift brings to the table, right? And since today is a sales call, I will keep it high level, but on top of Kubernetes, on top of that engine, right, that orchestration, that container orchestration engine, you get the platform services, you get application services, you get developer services. Each of these will be utilized for different either workloads, building cloud native apps, or focused on the developer productivity. And towards the top there, the advanced multi-cluster, the cluster management is very important, because this really helps you manage those workloads, make sure that they're compliant, make sure that they're configured correctly. And as you start getting into workloads that wouldn't run on the same OpenShift container platform as the rest of them, right? You might have 2 OpenShift container platforms in your organization because of the operating system you're leveraging is different, right? And then again, if you have questions on that, we would love to answer, but I don't want to dive too deep into a technical rabbit hole here. So again, kind of back to that cloud native apps piece and that very confusing slide that I put up of all of those different services. This is where that support of those ISVs really takes place and supports, right? So if you're using those tools, you have direct integration with the Openshift container platform to kind of be a one-stop platform or a one-stop shop to, again, just that efficiency itself will help your productivity as an IT team. So now more than ever, especially with the times we're living in, companies are trying to figure out how to be more efficient, how to be quicker, how to be more agile, and save IT spend. And this is a way to do that. Openshift Container Platform is a way to do that and future-proof yourself as we move into that cloud readiness and cloud native environment. So again, wanted to show you a slide, but Red Hat really tests and validates this whole stack for you. So again, if you're using these tools, and you can find these tools on Red Hat, or if you reach out to our team here, we can point you in the right direction to find these tools, and you can find if you're leveraging any of these. It helps you seamlessly integrate your current tools and investments into an OpenShift container strategy. And lastly, I just wanted to touch on some of the different offerings that OpenShift sits on as we start getting more and more hybrid, right? So if you're leveraging AWS, if you're leveraging Azure, Google Cloud, IBM Cloud, or you're doing this on-prem, right? There's vendor managed offerings and there's customer managed offerings. And if you're working with an IT provider, some of them have their own managed offerings as well. So there's different ways to look at this, and there's different ways to deploy this and provision and set this up. So make sure you're talking with your IT provider on what the best strategy would be for you. If you have an idea, this is a good time to brainstorm because everybody is kind of getting a little bit constricted here with budget and looking to find those efficiency gains within their business. So again, OpenShift is one of those, is a really great tool for IT teams to do that and to become cloud ready. So with that concludes presentation for today. I'll open it up for questions, or Felicia, if you can open it up for questions and tackle those. And if you have any feedback, if you have any of those tools, or you're looking to find where you can find a list of those different tools, we'd love to help and point you in the right direction. So just throw up our emails there. Again, my name is Jerome Martin. I am the vendor leader for Tech Data in our Red Hat group, and it was a pleasure to walk you through why OpenShift is a really great tool for the times, but also what Kubernetes is and what containers is and what VMs are. So hopefully it broke it down, made it simple to understand. I like to give examples. So if you liked it, would love feedback. If you didn't like it, would love that feedback as well. Always trying to hone the pitch and make it easy for everybody to understand instead of throwing a 1,000 different buzzwords at you and hoping that you get it right.
Thanks, Jerome. Does anybody have any questions? You can go ahead and either pop them in the Q&A or down in the chat, and we'll answer them promptly. Okay. All right. It doesn't look like we have any questions, Jerome, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up. Thank you for presenting.
Hey, no problem.